Well, we'll see. Thank you, Carol. Thank you for organizing this, Carol. Okay. So if I was standing here 100 years ago, or let's go back even further. Let's go 112 years ago. Let's start at the turn of the century, 1900. And I was standing here to a group of Americans concerned about what was happening in the country. And I said, what we need in this country is a minimum wage. And what we need is old age insurance so that people don't have to live out their last 10 or 15 or 20 years in desperation and misery. We should have an end to lynching, which was widespread at the time. Workers should have the right to unionize on the job. There should be laws protecting consumers against unsafe and unhealthy products. There should be laws protecting the public health against environmental dangers. There should be sewer systems and other forms of public health in all of our cities. We should have a progressive income tax. And we should give women the right to vote. If I'd said any of those things in 1900, you would have called me a dangerous communist or a wild-eyed dreaming utopian or just some kind of crazy person. Right? And yet all of those are things that today we take for granted. Those are all ideas that were once considered radical and are now considered common sense. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't people that still would like to roll back Social Security. There are people who tried to do that. But when George Bush tried to do that, he was unsuccessful because the American people have accepted Social Security as something they take for granted. And it was George Bush who was forced to sign a bill to raise the minimum wage because the overwhelming majority of American people believe that if you work full time, you should not live in poverty. And therefore, the government should set some standards for a floor below which no worker should fall. I think the minimum wage is much too low, of course. But the idea that we should have a minimum wage is widely accepted. So all these are ideas that were once considered radical and are now considered common sense. So I want to start off by posing a question that I hope we can come back to at the end. And I do this with my students as well. I'd like you to think about what your grandchildren or even your great-grandchildren will look back on in 50 years from now, in the year 2062. And they will look back at the year 2012. And they will say, Grandma, Granddad, Great-Granddad, Great-Grandma, I can't believe that way back in 2012, Americans didn't have fill in the blank, right? What is it that is considered radical, socialist, utopian, wild-eyed, unrealistic today that 50 years from now people will look back and say, these are things that we take for granted?
A sane energy policy.
Okay. Okay. Well, can we come back to that later? Okay. Right. So that's a good example, but we'll come back to that later. So I wrote this book, The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, a Social Justice Hall of Fame, in order to remind us, and particularly remind young people, but also remind people who might have forgotten or who need to be reminded, right, that the things we now take for granted that were once radical ideas are the result of social protest movements throughout the 20th century. And the people who were the leaders and the people who were the pioneers of this country in promoting these ideas should not be forgotten. And we should be celebrating them. And so I wrote this book in order to educate and stimulate and inspire and also to give people a sense that there are things today that we are troubled about, but that if we have some perspective, some historical perspective, we realize that at every year of the 20th century and the 21st century, and even going back earlier in our country, there were people who said this country is doomed, this is a terrible moment in our history, there's nothing we can do about it, the progressive movement is dead, right? I mean, everybody has had those moments throughout history, and yet we recover. We find ways to rebuild progressive activism, and we move the country forward in a way that I think is inspiring. And so it is true, as you said, that a lot of people are frustrated with and disappointed in President Obama, but I don't think it's true that he has governed for the 1%. I think that it's true that he is in a position right now, we could talk about later, where he's unable to govern on the values that he campaigned on because there isn't a viable left in this country that's pushing the Congress to be more responsive to the things that the president would like to have done but was unable to do. Now that's what I just said is obviously open to some debate and controversy, so I'm happy to talk about that later with you, right? So I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book, but I also want to talk a little bit about what's in the book and also try to weave in a little bit about my, my relationship and some of the history of Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington is one of the 100 people in the book. A couple of months ago, there was an article in some newspaper in New York. It wasn't one of the big dailies. It was one of the smaller neighborhood papers. And the headline was this: Norman Thomas beats George Washington. Does anybody have any idea what that meant? What was that story about? Was it a yes, Norman Thomas High School, right, beat George Washington High School in some athletic event, right? Right? And when we want to memorialize somebody, we want to honor them. We name schools after them. We name holidays after them. We name streets after them. Every city in America has a Martin Luther King Boulevard, a Martin Luther King Street. There's lots of Martin Luther King schools. When Martin Luther King was alive, right, he was considered a dangerous troublemaker and a communist. And there were billboards all over the South and some in the North and the Midwest that said that Martin Luther King was a communist, right? And he was vilified. And as you no doubt know, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was tapping his phones and trying to undermine his credibility, right? And this was going on up through until he died, right? Now, in retrospect, we consider Martin Luther King a saint, right? And we have, and young people have, you know, celebrate along with the rest of us Martin Luther King Day every year, although that was a very difficult thing to get past Congress. There were, even in the 1970s, when they were, and up through the 80s, before Martin Luther King Day was an official holiday, there were a lot of Southern and even some Midwestern senators who refused to vote for it because they didn't want to be identified with celebrating Martin Luther King. But today, even the most conservative people recognize Martin Luther King as a saint, but in his own day, he was considered a radical. Another example, right? Helen Keller, right? Helen Keller is known by most Americans as the person who the movie and the play The Miracle Worker was about. A blind girl who became blind young in life, and at 8 years old she learned how to read and to spell and to speak words because of the loving care of her teacher, Anne Sullivan. And the famous scene in the movie The Miracle Worker is when her teacher, Anne Sullivan, is at a pump in her home in Alabama, and she puts water on her hand, and she's taught her, eventually she's able to say the word wawa, water. And that's when her sense of feel and her sense of touch and her mind connects that what she is feeling is water, and she can say the word for it. And she eventually does learn to speak. Right? I went on the Helen Keller official website the other day, as I did when I was writing the book. It's in a small town in Alabama, her home, the home where she grew up. And it's on the official National Historic Register. And on the website, there's a biography of Helen Keller. This is the official National Helen Keller historical site. And it tells you the story of Helen Keller up to the point where she learns how to read and write when she's 8 years old. And then it says, oh, by the way, she went to Radcliffe and graduated college. First deaf, blind person, as she was called, to graduate from college. Nowhere on the official website of Helen Keller does it say that she was a socialist, that she campaigned for Eugene Debs when he ran for president, that she was a feminist and very active in the women's suffrage movement, that she was a pacifist and gave speeches, including a famous speech at Town Hall in New York against World War I, that she was, during the McCarthy era, she spoke out against McCarthyism, that she was an incredibly courageous, radical person. And that Helen Keller, who might be blind but had an incredible radical vision, right, is unknown to most Americans. Another example, right? About 2 weeks ago, Googling on the internet, I saw another headline that said that Rustin High School students win science fair. Right? This was in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Students at this high school in Westchester, Pennsylvania had won a science contest. And the high school was called Rustin High School. And it was named after Bayard Rustin. Right? Bayard Rustin, how many people know who he was? Right? Bayard Rustin was black. He was gay. He was a socialist. And he was a convicted criminal, right? And a pacifist. Right? He was one of the great, courageous heroes of the civil rights movement, but many people don't know his name because he was gay, and at the time, during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, being gay and being a socialist and a former communist meant that you were not going to be a public figure. And so in the 1940s, Bayard Rustin was the leader of a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and he began the first freedom rides, not the 1961 freedom rides, but the 1947 freedom rides. He was the first freedom rider, where he took buses with other members of CORE, including James Farmer and some others, and tried to integrate the interstate bus system, and got arrested, was put on a chain gang. During World War II, he was a militant pacifist. He refused to be a conscientious objector. He thought it was unfair for someone to be a conscientious objector, so he went to jail, and he was put on a chain gang. He was arrested dozens of times. Right? In 1963, in 1954 and 55, he was sent by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a militant pacifist group run by another person in my book named A.J. Muste, one of the great heroes of pacifism in the 20th century. Muste sent Bayard Rustin to Montgomery to educate this young 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King on how to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, which Rustin had 20 years experience doing and Martin Luther King had none. So he went down to Montgomery, right? But the word had come before he arrived that he was gay and had been a communist and by then was a socialist. And so Martin Luther King was warned by his friends, you better not be seen with this guy Bayard Rustin. And so he was a little nervous about that, and ultimately Bayard Rustin had to leave Montgomery in the middle of the night in the trunk of a car in order to avoid being himself probably killed or at least seriously injured. But for the next 15 years, 14 years while Martin Luther King was still alive, he wrote most of Martin Luther King's books. He ghost-wrote his books. He wrote many of his speeches. He wrote the Freedom Budget, which was the budget that Martin Luther King used for the Poor People's March in 1968. He was a close advisor to Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, but he was not so publicly. So, and he was not in the closet. He was to his friends, they knew he was gay, right? But to the wider public, he was still not known as being a homosexual until In 1953, he came here to Los Angeles to give a speech. He was an incredible speaker, a great orator, and an incredible singer as well. And he was in Pasadena at the Pasadena Athletic Club giving a speech for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. After the speech was over, he was walking back to his hotel, and some young men in a car drove up to him and tried to pick him up, and he accepted the offer, and he wound up getting arrested by the Pasadena police for having gay sex in the car. And at that point, his homosexuality was out. Right? And when Martin Luther King and another great civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph, the head of the first black trade union of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, when they were organizing the famous 1963 March on Washington, right, A. Philip Randolph said to his fellow civil rights and labor leaders, including Walter Reuther, who was part of that coalition that built that great march, who's also in my book, he said, "We need to get the best organizer in America to make sure that this is a successful March on Washington." They had this idea of having 100,000 people show up in Washington for the Civil Rights March to push the Kennedy administration to pass a civil rights bill. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It wasn't just for civil rights, it was for jobs and freedom. So we need to get the best organizer in America to build this coalition to get people to come to Washington. And so A. Philip Randolph said, we're going to hire my right-hand man, Bayard Rustin. And some of the civil rights leaders objected because they knew of his reputation. And A. Philip Randolph said, if we don't hire Bayard Rustin, we're not going to have this march. And so we hired Bayard Rustin to be his assistant to organize the march. The march had 250,000 people. It's the famous march where Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. 2 days before the march, Strom Thurmond, the right-wing segregationist senator from South Carolina, had read into the congressional record the police report from Pasadena about Bayard Rustin's arrest 15 years earlier. And Bayard Rustin's biographer, which biography came out a couple years ago, said that at that moment in history, Bayard Rustin was the most famous homosexual in America, but not by his own doing, right? So Bayard Rustin was an incredibly radical person, right? In 2002, the school board in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is a Republican area outside of Philadelphia, the school district is 89% white, was building a new high school, and they had to figure out who they're going to name it after. Well, it turns out the most famous person from Westchester, Pennsylvania is Bayard Rustin, right? Who had gone to the other high school in the town. And so there was a movement in Westchester to name the high school after Bayard Rustin, right? And there was, of course, protest against it. How could we name a high school, particularly in a Republican, mostly white area, after a black, socialist, gay radical, right? Pacifist. But they did. They named it after Bayard Rustin. And I called up the principal of the high school about 3 weeks ago for an article that I wrote for a magazine called Commonweal. And I asked her, do any of these students in your school know who Bayard Rustin is? Because my daughter goes to Marshall High School in Pasadena, and I asked her the other day, do you know who your high school is named after? She said, some guy named Marshall. They don't teach at Marshall High School anything about John Marshall, the Supreme Court justice that he was named after. So I asked the principal, does anybody in your high school know who Bayard Rustin is? She says, yes. Every year we have a Bayard Rustin Day, and we tell the students, whose parents are Republicans mostly, who Bayard Rustin is. It was his 100th anniversary of his birth. He died many years ago, 25 years ago. In June, they had a big birthday celebration. His picture is on the wall as you get into the school, right? So they know who Bayard Rustin is, right? And so there are a lot of great public figures, many of them in my book, who are well known, like Martin Luther King. And then there are many people in my book who are not well known, but who should be. And that's why I wrote the book. And I passed out a flyer so that you can see who is in the book. Please don't look at it now, but during the Q&A section, if you want to ask me any questions about it, I'd be happy to. But the book began when I wrote an article about 2 years ago in The Nation magazine. Some of you may remember this. This was the cover story of The Nation magazine in October of 2010. And it was called The 50 Most Influential Progressives of the 20th Century. Remember, it was 50. And each entry was about 200 words. The book, each entry is a little over 2,000 words. So, and according to the editor of The Nation, Katrina vanden Heuvel, they got more comments on this article that I wrote than almost any article they've had in a long time. Not probably, there's been some others that have had more, but they had over 1,000 comments, people writing into the magazine. And the comments came, there were two different kinds of comments. One is, how dare you put that person on that list? This person doesn't belong in the list of the 50 most influential progressives. And the other was, how dare you leave off this person, you know, who wasn't on the list? You should have put this other person on the list. And they invited the readers to give suggestions for who was left out. But the response to the article was so big that Katrina and I talked about it and said, you know, I should write a book, expanding the article from 50 to 100, expanding the summaries of their lives, their profiles from little 200-word snippets to a larger article-length profile, and give people a sense of who these people are. And so that's what I did. And there are three kinds of people in the book. There are organizers and activists. And those are the kind of people that you probably mostly think about when you think about progressive history. People who are on the front lines of different struggles of the labor movement, the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the civil liberties movement, the movements against war, the movements against poverty, and so forth. And so those are people like Eugene Debs, Jane Addams, Rose Schneiderman, the great union organizer for, around the time of the Triangle Fire, A. Philip Randolph, Dorothy Day, the great founder of the Catholic worker movement, Ella Baker, the great civil rights activist that most of my students haven't heard of, but who played an enormously important role in the civil rights movement. Labor leaders like Walter Reuther and Sidney Hillman, Miles Horton, the founder of the Highlander Folk School, which is a great training school still in Tennessee for civil rights and labor activists. David Brower, not the founder, but really the leader for 20 years of the Sierra Club. Jerry Worf, the great leader of AFSCME. Cesar Chavez, James Lawson, the minister who was involved in the civil rights movement, who still lives in LA and is in his 80s now. Jesse Jackson, Tom Hayden, people like that. The second group of people are people who influenced our culture and changed our values and helped to inspire people with giving them a sense that there's hope and possibility for a better world. And these included writers and musicians and playwrights and novelists, journalists, some lawyers and some theologians. The people on this list include Lewis Hine. Anybody know who Lewis Hine was? Good, then you need to read the book. Lewis Hine was a great photographer who during the early part of the 20th century took incredibly realistic and poignant photographs of sweatshops and children living in slums. And he worked very closely with Jane Addams and Florence Kelley and other people who in the movement to abolish child labor. And it was his photographs that you're probably familiar with, but you don't even know who took the photos. So Lewis Hine was an example of that. Langston Hughes, the great poet. Paul Robeson, the great singer and actor. Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Bruce Springsteen, John Dewey, the philosopher, but he was more than a philosopher, he was also an activist and a writer. Charlotte Perkins, one of the early feminists who lived in Pasadena for part of her life. Emma Goldman, Upton Sinclair, who was famous mostly for writing the book The Jungle, but also ran for governor of California and almost was elected in 1934. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi and anti-war and civil rights activist. Studs Terkel, Arthur Miller, Gloria Steinem, and Michael Harrington, who I'll get to in a second. And then the third category are politicians. People who ran for office and who were elected to office and who brought these ideas into the public debate, and also some Supreme Court justices who helped to move these ideas into law. And so these people include Louis Brandeis and Thurgood Marshall, who was both a civil rights activist and a lawyer and also a Supreme Court justice. Tom Johnson, the radical mayor of Cleveland at the turn of the century, who I wish Antonio Villaraigosa knew a little more about. Robert La Follette, Filippo LaGuardia, Robert Wagner, after whom the famous Wagner Act, giving workers the right to unionize, was named. Vito Marcantonio, the left-wing congressman from Harlem, from New York. Ted Kennedy, Harvey Milk, Paul Wellstone, and then a few people who I think are probably controversial in this list. I put Theodore Roosevelt in there, I put Franklin Roosevelt in there, and I put Lyndon Johnson in there. And I know there are probably people that wonder why I did that, and we can talk about that later, right? So those are the kinds of people that are in the book. And I just want to say a few general words about them and then talk a bit about Mike. All of these people, some of these people played all three roles. Some people were politicians and organizers and activists and great writers, thinkers, and inspirational figures. But not all of them were saints. And in the introductory chapter, I say that some of them they're heroes, but they're not saints. They were real human beings, and they lived in real time. And they made mistakes. They made personal mistakes, and they made political mistakes. And I don't try to whitewash that side of them in the book. I try to point out, because it's important that we not put these people on such a big pedestal that we think that no one else can be that way. These were real human beings with flaws. And as I said, some of these were political flaws, and some of them were personal flaws. So let me just give you a few examples of that. Alice Paul. Alice Paul was probably the most important leader of the women's suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century. She, more than anyone else, organized the movement to get women the right to vote, to get state legislatures to pass the constitutional amendment. She was a radical. There were big divisions inside the women's suffrage movement. She tried to bring them together. She wasn't always successful. But she was a remarkable person who lived a long life and lived long enough to see the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 70s, and was also involved in the anti-war movement and so forth. But she was an anti-Semite. She grew up in a culture of anti-Semitism, and she was not very welcoming to Jewish suffragists and feminists into her movement. Another example of that, something like that, is Margaret Sanger, who's one of the 100 people in the book, is the founding mother of Planned Parenthood and of birth control. She coined the phrase birth control. She had enormous courage. She was active in the Socialist Party. She was active in labor struggles in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and other places. But she's mostly famous in her role on birth control and women's reproductive freedom. She got arrested many times because it was against the law to distribute contraceptive devices or even to write about them. And it was thanks to her that many laws were changed and that doctors were allowed to give advice and to distribute materials. So she's in the last year or two, since the Republican Party's been going after Planned Parenthood, they've been attacking Margaret Sanger. And she gave them an excuse to attack her in some ways, because for part of her life, she was involved with eugenics, which was the scientific view, the pseudo-scientific view, that there are superior and inferior races or based on genetics, and that we can purify the race, as the Nazis tried to do, by using medical engineering, basically. Now, Margaret Sanger was not a racist, and she did not believe that we should stop immigrants from coming to this country because they are biologically or mentally inferior, which was part of the reason for the eugenics movement. It was probably an anti-immigrant movement. But she did believe in using eugenics to help women avoid pregnancies and deliveries of children who had serious illnesses. And you know, there are still people today that think that's okay, right? But back when she did it, it was quite controversial, and she later regretted that part of her life, but it is a part of her life, and the right wing hangs her with that part of her life when they're attacking Planned Parenthood. They say that all of Planned Parenthood is really a form of eugenics, which is not true.